the world has changed. The bar that your SaaS products had to have has changed. So if you look at Salesforce and the way they started, if you look at the initial screenshots, you can really tell that the product was fairly complex, right? But building a SaaS in 2023 is very different than building a SaaS when actually you were the first SaaS ever launched. Expectations have changed, the bar keeps increasing, and you're being compared with an increasingly number of great products. Hi folks, and welcome to this new series where I'm going to cover some of my favorite frameworks when it comes to building products. These are stuff that I've posted on LinkedIn if you're following me, or just stuff that experts from the industry are sharing and that I really love. Today I want to take some time to talk about the knowledge gap. So I first heard about the knowledge gap from Kevin Hell, a Y Combinator partner, who explained what it was during a presentation called Building a Product That People Love. And I was just so astonished by this concept that I dived into it and learned that it was actually introduced by another design expert called Jared Spool. I'm going to go through the concept in a second, but why I think this concept is so interesting is because even though it's a design concept, it actually applies more broadly to how you can run your company, organize your headcounts and things like that. The knowledge gap is a spectrum where on the one hand, you have no knowledge. People don't know anything about your product. And on the other side, there is the perfect knowledge. People know everything in the world they should know about your product. Imagine a line which is your current knowledge point. On the right hand of the spectrum, imagine there is a target knowledge point. So the target knowledge point is the amount of knowledge that people need to have to use your product. The current knowledge point is what they currently know about your product, what they currently understand when they see your website, read your documentation, when someone else talks about you and your product. The space between these two lines is the knowledge gap. The target knowledge that you have depends a lot on your product and your strategy. Depending on where the knowledge needs to be, the gap is going to be more or less big, and the gap you will have to close potentially is going to be different. Maybe you're in a hotel room and maybe you want to call the reception, and you're going to pick up the phone and you're not sure which button you need to click on to call the reception. And if there is no paper next to the phone, or if no one has told you when you checked in, it's going to be very hard to know which one it is. This is a typical knowledge gap, and if the gap is not closed, you're not going to be able to achieve the actions that you wanted to do. Ideally, products can close the gaps by default. And the way you can do that is by building a product which is so simple and intuitive that the knowledge gap is going to be closed by itself. So think about a product like Shazam, for instance. It's very easy. You just install it and there is just this big button. You don't have anything to do to sign up, register, customize. It's just working with one click. This is a great example of a product that has a very, very tiny gap. However, not all the products out there can have a tiny gap. Some products are just more complex. This is, for instance, the case of Salesforce. Salesforce is a product that lets you do so many things and has so much customization that you're not going to get an experience which is as simple as the one that you get with Shazam. So the amount of design that you need to close the knowledge gap will depend on the level of knowledge that you want to maximize for people. And this can be done with product, this can be done with other solutions. One thing which is very important is where do you put the line on the knowledge spectrum? So the current knowledge is something you can't really influence. Like that's the amount of knowledge that people have roughly when they come to your product. It's usually contextualized by who they are, their expertise with your industry, how digital native they are maybe. But the target point is something that you can actually set yourself. What is the amount of knowledge that my product will need to be used? This is a line that you can draw yourself based on your strategy. The gap is usually defined by your market. So in the case of Salesforce, the gap was defined by Oracle and the amount of knowledge you needed to have to install a CD and get started. And when Salesforce came in, they reduced significantly the knowledge gap that you have to start using a tool like them. So depending on the industry, depending on the strategy, depending on the persona you're getting, also the value prop you want to deliver to these people, your target knowledge line might be more left on the far right, and the amount of knowledge gap that you want to close might be more or less significant. Let's jump into how you can close the knowledge gap. There are a couple of ways to do it. Basically, you can either increase the amount of knowledge that people have, or you can decrease the amount of knowledge that people need to have to use your product or services. So how do you increase the amount of knowledge? Well, you can have better articles, a better FAQ, you may have tool tips, or you may have customer success who is available whenever there is a question. You can also decrease the amount of knowledge which is needed. The most famous way to do that is by making your product less complex. So I mentioned Shazam as being a great example. I think Uber is also a very good example. If you're like a later stage company, a great way to reduce the complexity is also by reducing the number of concepts in your product. So a great example is Intercom. Intercom has lots of features in their product, yet the way they currently categorize them is very easy. On the one hand, you have the inbound features, so everything that you have to do, you can do, which is related to inbound, fit into one category on the left sidebar. On the other side, you have the outbound features, so everything which is related to outbound, to reaching out proactively your customers, is in the outbound features. So for instance, emails or banners are in the outbound, while the chat is in the inbound section. Over time, as your product complexity increases, what we're seeing is companies trying to refine, reshuffle, reduce the number of concepts, crunch some of them, delete some of them, bundle some of them, to try to keep the experience and the knowledge gap as small as possible. When companies grow and add more features and usually more complexity, they try to find ways to remain simple. So if you think about HubSpot, which I believe is a great example, they have a lot of features, right? So what they're trying to do to reduce the complexity is understand from the get-go why you're coming to their product, what you're trying to achieve. The same happens with Adobe, the same happens with Intercom. Notion now is a pretty hairy product. Airtable is also a great example. So what these people do is they ask you upfront why you're using the product, or if you come from a campaign with a UTM, they might use this information, and then they're going to try to funnel you through the right experience, the right state of features and values for the use case that you have. By breaking down their product offering into smaller chunks and really trying to understand which journey you should go through, they're able to reduce again the knowledge gap. Another analogy that I really like is video games. If some of you have ever played video games, you will notice that there is often a learning mode. You're often learning at the beginning of the game how to play it. One great example I've seen recently is Zelda on the Nintendo Switch. Basically, they created an open world video game, meaning that the player can go in any direction when they start. And that was an increasing challenge for them because they had to teach the player how to play the game, but also let the player do whatever he or she wanted. And so the way Zelda's team actually nailed that problem was by putting some cues in the landscape of things that people could potentially do. And as the player was curious and, heading toward the road or toward the trees because there was like a shiny apple or something like that, they would learn the main commands of the player. So to be specific, on that Zelda game, you can climb the trees. And instead of teaching you that you can climb, they will just show you a shiny apple in the tree. And if you get closer, you will see your character climbing to that tree. The knowledge gap at this moment was reduced in a very elegant and natural way that actually felt like almost you discovered something yourself. It didn't feel like you were taught something. The next question is, how can you measure whether it was close or not? So there are many ways, of course, to do that depending on the current gap that you have. But one very common place where the gap can be closed is the activation step. The activation is the early experience that people have with your product. So if you have a product with a self-serve experience, whether it's a B2B or a B2C app, the traditional way to look at activation is through 3 steps that were defined by Reforge. The first one is the sign-up step, so making sure that people actually, fill their email and password usually. The second step is a setup phase, which is applicable for some products, but not all of them. And the third one is called the habit forming loop. So the set of actions that people take to get used to your product and start to use it on a repeated basis. The best way you can actually measure whether this activation worked for you is looking into the percentage of people that are going through these steps, or if you're a B2B SaaS, the percentage of companies that are going through these steps. Things become a bit more complex when you're a B2B SaaS because potentially an account is only going to activate if a certain amount of people are doing certain things. So you may have a threshold on the number of admins doing something, or you may have an admin doing the setup and then an end user using the product. So the dynamics can be a little bit more complex. I hope you learned some things today about the knowledge gap. I think it's an amazing, simple framework to actually understand how you should craft your experience in your product, how you should allocate your resources as a company to help as many people as possible to gain the right level of knowledge to use your product. I think it's also a very neutral framework because it allows you to define a target knowledge wherever you want based on your strategy. If you want to see more of these frameworks, please let me know. You can DM me on LinkedIn and reach out by any channels. I'm very happy to go through more of them in the coming weeks. Yeah, hope you like them. Thanks so much for listening.